On the afternoon of 12th of February 2013, along a wind-scoured bend of the Damascus-Beirut highway near Zabadani, a silver SUV slowed behind a line of trucks, its windshield veiled by road dust and thin winter light. Inside, a man in his late 50s, IRGC General Hassan Shateri, traveling under his alias Hessam Khoshnevis, reached forward with a cloth and wiped a faint smear from the small camera lens he used to record reconstruction sites in southern Lebanon. 2 days later, Iranian outlets and foreign wires reduced the moment to a single line: martyred on the road linking Damascus with Beirut. In Tehran and Beirut, he was remembered as the engineer general who rebuilt villages and quietly rebuilt rocket emplacements. In Tel Aviv, analysts added a red cross to a diagram of Iranian command links along the Mediterranean coast. By evening, traffic moved again on the mountain road, but the camera in the SUV lay shattered, its lens beyond cleaning, an absence that would echo longer than any claim of success. In late autumn 2006, the Bir Hassan area near Iran's embassy in Beirut hummed with reconstruction activity after the July War. Concrete mixers churned along cratered streets, while Iranian engineers and Hezbollah cadres surveyed collapsed bridges through surveying equipment and handheld cameras. The dust from demolished buildings still hung in the air 3 months after the ceasefire, coating everything in fine gray powder that required constant cleaning from equipment lenses and windshields. Into this organized chaos arrived Hassan Shateri, an IRGC veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, whom Tehran had appointed to lead the Iranian Committee for the Reconstruction of Lebanon under the carefully chosen alias Hessam Khoshnevis. Western intelligence assessments and Iranian media later described him as both civil engineer and Quds Force officer, a dual identity that managed budgets estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. His mandate covered schools, roads, bridges, and according to later analyses by the Middle East Institute, tunnel systems and rocket sites embedded within that civilian landscape. The FDD's Long War Journal would eventually document how his reconstruction projects followed specific patterns: community centers with reinforced basements, schools with unusual electrical capacity, roads rated for weights that exceeded any civilian vehicle in Lebanon's inventory. Inside modest offices adjacent to the Iranian embassy compound, reconstruction maps covered walls beside satellite prints of southern Lebanon's hills, each elevation marked with coordinates only certain viewers understood. The morning light through dusty windows illuminated engineering drafts that showed standard municipal buildings in their upper floors, but revealed subterranean spaces whose purposes remained unspecified in the official documentation. A former Lebanese contractor who worked with the Iranian committee recalled the meticulous attention to foundation work. They insisted on depths and reinforcement that seemed excessive for the structures above ground. We joked that they were building for earthquakes in a country that rarely has them. In one archival photograph from November 2006, an unidentified aide wipes dust from a camcorder lens before recording a newly poured bridge foundation. The simple maintenance of documentation that would define so much of what followed. The camera captured concrete forms and rebar, but what it truly recorded was the beginning of an infrastructure that served two overlapping purposes: public rebuilding and private preparation. Behind the aide, Shateri stood examining blueprints, his own small camera hanging from his neck, a tool he would carry throughout his 7 remaining years. By December 2006, Shateri had established a pattern that would persist for years. Morning meetings with municipal officials discussing water pipes and electrical grids, where conversations carefully avoided mention of the unusual specifications for pump stations that could move more than water. Afternoon surveys of construction sites, where basement depths exceeded typical residential requirements by factors that made local engineers exchange knowing glances. Evening reports to Tehran, detailing progress on projects whose strategic value lay beneath their humanitarian surface. The foundation work proceeds on schedule, read one intercepted progress report from that winter. Though which foundations, civilian or military, remained deliberately ambiguous. The Guardian would later profile Shateri as the engineer of Hezbollah's underground, though during these early months he appeared simply as another Iranian official distributing reconstruction funds. Local Lebanese officials who needed schools rebuilt and roads repaired asked a few questions about why Iranian engineers insisted on particular specifications. The money flowed, the concrete poured, and if foundations went deeper than necessary, that seemed like Iranian over-engineering rather than strategic planning. By May 2010, Shateri's projects had transformed the Tyre Bint Jbeil corridor in South Lebanon. New schools rose from rubble, housing blocks replaced destroyed neighborhoods, and roads carved efficient paths through terrain that had frustrated Israeli armor in 2006. The transformation was visible from satellite imagery that showed before and after contrasts, cratered landscapes becoming organized grids of reconstruction. Agricultural access roads widened to highway specifications, coastal villages sprouting communications towers that exceeded cellular needs. Local officials interviewed years later described a dense mesh of civil works that coincidentally improved access to coastal zones ideal for anti-ship missile emplacements. A former mayor of a southern village recalled Shateri's visits. He would arrive with a convoy of engineers, spend hours examining sites, photographing every angle. His camera was always ready, always documenting. Once, I saw him spend 20 minutes photographing a drainage culvert from different positions. Only later did we understand he wasn't interested in water flow. The reconstruction followed patterns that IRGC doctrine had refined since the 1980s. Tehran's strategy to extend its deterrent reach from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Using Hezbollah's coastal strip as a forward platform, Iran could now credibly threaten Israeli ports and offshore gas fields without deploying a single naval vessel. The Council on Foreign Relations would later document this as part of Iran's maritime resistance strategy, achieving sea denial capabilities through land-based infrastructure that appeared purely civilian to casual observation. Shateri appeared in footage from this period as the visiting engineer, inspecting concrete forms at dawn when the light best revealed surface imperfections, walking coastal roads with local commanders at dusk when the shadows highlighted elevation changes crucial for military planning. His small digital camera documented each pour and placement with obsessive precision. The Modern War Institute at West Point would later analyze his methodology as dual-use development, every project serving legitimate civilian needs while creating military capabilities. A municipal clerk in Bint Jbeil later recalled leafing through construction contracts from 2010, pausing on pages stamped with logos of IRGC-linked NGOs, the paper trail connecting Tehran's money to Lebanon's ground. Everything was transparent, he insisted to investigators, though transparency meant different things to different audiences. The contracts showed schools and clinics, the basements beneath them appeared on no public blueprint. Payment vouchers listed materials for agricultural storage facilities that required reinforced concrete, typically used for bunkers. South of Tyre, in a village rebuilt with Iranian funds, a home video from July 2010 captured a moment of unintended symbolism. A boy playfully smeared his fingerprint across the family camera lens while filming a celebration in their new community center. An adult hand entered the frame, carefully wiping the glass clean with a white cloth. Off-screen, someone laughed at the child's mischief. The center's foundation, poured under Shateri's supervision, extended 12 feet underground, unusual for a single-story structure in a region without frost concerns. Years later, Israeli intelligence would identify that community center as a Hezbollah command node, its innocent celebration hall concealing communications equipment in those carefully documented foundations. Israeli intelligence had begun flagging the reconstruction engineer in classified assessments that year. Aerial surveillance noted the peculiar depth of certain foundations, the reinforced walls of supposed agricultural warehouses, the coastal roads wide enough for vehicles larger than any local farmer possessed. Analysts at the Israeli Alma Research and Education Center would later describe this period as when Iran's strategic construction became impossible to ignore. Yet nothing had exploded. No rockets had launched. The building continued. By autumn 2010, Shateri had perfected his routine. A former IRGC colleague, speaking anonymously to researchers years later, described his methodology. He treated every project as if he was building it twice. Once for the people who would use it daily. Once for the war that would eventually come. Every school could shelter rockets. Every road could move launchers. Every foundation could survive airstrikes and be rebuilt quickly. October 2011 found Shateri in a Damascus safe house in the Medsi district, the Syrian uprising transforming his transit routes into combat zones. The normally busy streets outside carried military vehicles instead of civilian traffic, and the sound of distant artillery had become part of the city's daily rhythm. The Iran-Damascus-Beirut corridor that had operated smoothly for 5 years now required armed escorts and alternate paths through territories that shifted control weekly. Testimony from defectors and captured documents later revealed how senior Quds Force officers like Shateri rotated between frontline advising in Syria and logistical supervision in Lebanon, their dual roles becoming increasingly difficult to separate. The Institute for the Study of War documented his presence at coordination meetings where Iranian advisors planned both the defense of Damascus and the continued flow of weapons to Hezbollah, twin objectives that required the same roads Shateri knew intimately. A declassified analytical map from this period sketched the IRGC's corridors, commercial flights from Tehran to Damascus International Airport, then ground transport along the M5 highway, or the Damascus-Beirut road into Lebanon. The routes had multiplied as the Syrian conflict intensified, with alternate paths through the Bekaa Valley, secondary roads through Kalamun, and even sea routes to Lebanese ports when land corridors became too dangerous. The same arteries that carried construction materials also transported items of different purpose. Shipments that arrived as airplane cargo and departed as Hezbollah arsenal. Shateri knew these routes with the intimacy of someone who had traveled them for years. A Syrian intelligence defector later told investigators that Shateri could describe every checkpoint, every vulnerable choke point, every alternate route from memory. He carried maps in his head that were more detailed than our official charts, the defector claimed. This knowledge would prove both invaluable and ultimately fatal. Predictability born from expertise. In the safe house, uniforms hung beside civilian clothes on the same rack. Engineering reports stacked beside satellite imagery on the same desk. A small digital camera sat in its case, lens cap removed for cleaning. The ritual performed even in spaces where no construction occurred. Shateri's aide, who survived the February 2013 attack, would later tell Iranian media about these Damascus stays. The general would spend hours reviewing photographs from construction sites, comparing them with satellite images, making notes in margins about angles and elevations that seemed important only to him. The operative's cover life as an engineer had become indistinguishable from his operational identity. Both required the same movements, the same meetings, the same careful documentation of ground truth. Understanding War documented this period as when Iranian operations in Syria became institutionalized, with officers like Shateri establishing patterns that would persist throughout the conflict. Former Israeli intelligence officials later acknowledged that debates intensified in Tel Aviv during this period about preemptive action against Iranian assets in Lebanon and Syria. Every month of delay meant another warehouse, another tunnel, another launching position, one analyst recalled in a 2018 interview with the Times of Israel. The target lists grew longer. Shateri's name appeared with increasing frequency, tagged not just as an individual, but as a node in an expanding network that threatened to fundamentally alter the regional balance. A report from the Brookings Institution, published years later, would describe this moment as a strategic inflection point, when Israel had to decide whether to accept Iranian entrenchment or begin the systematic campaign of interdiction that would define the next decade. Shateri embodied this dilemma. An engineer whose work was unquestionably civilian in appearance, but military in ultimate purpose. The paradox of his position became clear by late 2011. The more successful his reconstruction efforts, the more visible he became to those who viewed such construction as preparation for war. Every school that opened made the network more resilient. Every road that was paved created another supply line. Every foundation that went too deep raised questions about what it truly supported. His success had become his vulnerability. March 2012 transformed Tel Aviv's operations floor into a constellation of screens displaying satellite feeds from Lebanon and Syria. The room, located in a building whose address remained classified, hummed with the white noise of electronics and muted conversations in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. Open-source accounts and later interviews with Israeli analysts described how the IRGC Quds Force presence had been integrated into comprehensive target banks, not merely lists of individuals, but entire networks of depots, roads, and coastal sites that Shateri's projects had quietly reinforced. One monitor showed satellite imagery of South Lebanon's coast. Ports improved with Iranian money. Breakwaters that could shelter more than fishing boats. Inland roads rated for loads heavier than agricultural traffic. The resolution was sharp enough to count individual concrete blocks and seawalls that Shateri had inspected personally. Another screen displayed intelligence digests with recurring mentions of an IRGC general whose reconstruction work appeared in Lebanese and Iranian media with suspicious frequency. The Alma Research and Education Center would later publish sanitized versions of these assessments, showing how Israeli intelligence mapped the overlap between civilian projects and military infrastructure. Every school built with Iranian funds was photographed, measured, and assessed for dual use. Every road improvement was analyzed for its ability to move military vehicles. Every foundation that went deeper than necessary was flagged for follow-up observation. The analysts working these targets operated under Mossad director Tamir Pardo, who had assumed leadership in 2011 with a mandate to expand Israel's campaign between wars, the systematic disruption of Iranian arms transfers and infrastructure development before they matured into existential threats. We learned to see construction itself as a weapons system. One retired analyst explained to ProPublica years later. A road isn't just concrete and asphalt. It's a potential route for moving missiles. A warehouse isn't just storage. It's a potential arsenal. The Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv would later document this shift in Israeli strategic thinking. From reactive defense to preemptive shaping of the battlefield. Shateri's projects exemplified why this shift seemed necessary. Traditional military targets could be identified and struck when war began. But civilian infrastructure that served military purposes had to be addressed before it could be activated. A technician maintaining the facility's surveillance systems performed his own routine that spring, popping open camera domes to wipe away condensation that clouded the feeds from the Mediterranean humidity. The parallel was unconscious but precise. Clarity required constant maintenance, whether for cameras watching Lebanon or analysts tracking Iranian generals. The man would later tell investigators that he cleaned the same cameras that had tracked Shateri's movements, though at the time, the Iranian general was just another face in the feeds. For those studying the screens, human figures remained abstract data points until a decision moved them from observation to action. A former intelligence officer, writing in intelligence history years later under a pseudonym, described the psychological distance required. You watch someone for months or years. You know their routines, their associates, their habits. But you have to maintain professional detachment. They're not people, they're targets, until suddenly they are people, and you have to live with what that means. In Tehran that same month, Shateri prepared for another rotation to Lebanon. Iranian state media would later describe this period as the height of his reconstruction achievements. Thousands of housing units completed, hundreds of kilometers of roads paved, dozens of schools opened. Fars news agency published photographs of him at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, always with his camera, always documenting. What the media didn't mention were the reinforced basements, the municipal buildings with generator capacity exceeding any civilian need, the coastal structures whose foundations could support far more than their modest superstructures suggested. The abstract figure on Tel Aviv's screens was about to travel a very concrete road. His next journey would follow patterns that algorithms had detected, routes that satellites had mapped, timings that analysts had predicted. The intersection of human decision and technological capability was approaching. June 2012 found Shateri in Beirut's southern suburbs, the Dahieh district that served as Hezbollah's administrative and social center. The neighborhood showed few scars from 2006. Iranian reconstruction had been thorough. New apartment blocks rose higher than their predecessors, their foundations proportionally deeper. Streets widened to accommodate traffic that hadn't yet materialized. Municipal buildings sprouted communication arrays that seemed excessive for local governance. Investigative reporting from this period described Shateri's oversight of what analysts called an Iranian-backed interstate within Lebanon. The Middle East Institute documented thousands of projects under his supervision. Clinics that stored more than medicine, schools with basement classrooms that were never used for teaching, roads that connected to nothing visible but aligned perfectly with coordinates of interest to military planners. Shateri had created parallel infrastructure beyond Lebanese government control. Each project served its stated humanitarian purpose while embedding capabilities that transformed Hezbollah from militia to proto-military force. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies would later calculate that Iranian investment in Lebanese reconstruction exceeded $2 billion between 2006 and 2012, with Shateri personally overseeing projects worth hundreds of millions. Archival photographs showed him touring neighborhoods in civilian clothes, a camera often in hand, documenting progress with the methodical patience of someone building for decades, not years. His Nikon D300, identified in multiple photographs, became as much a part of his identity as his revolutionary credentials. Local officials who worked with him recalled an engineer who insisted on quality. Foundations properly cured, materials tested to specifications, drainage systems over-designed for Lebanese weather patterns. Only later would analysts understand that over-engineering for peacetime meant resilience in wartime. A Lebanese contractor who worked on multiple projects described Shateri's attention to detail. He would photograph everything, every stage of construction, every angle of every foundation. Once, we had to delay pouring concrete for a school because he wanted to photograph the rebar configuration at sunset when the shadows would show any imperfections in the grid. He said documentation was as important as construction itself. The coastal infrastructure received particular attention. By hardening communication nodes and improving ports, Shateri made it easier for Hezbollah to receive seaborne shipments and threaten shipping lanes off Israel's coast. The Modern War Institute's assessment noted this maritime strategy without a navy, achieving sea denial capability through land-based systems hidden within civilian reconstruction. Coastal roads were improved to handle mobile launcher systems. Seaside structures included reinforced positions with clear sight lines to shipping lanes. Port facilities gained capabilities that exceeded fishing fleet requirements. In a videotaped sermon from late 2012, pro-Hezbollah cleric Mohammad Yazbek would eulogize Shateri as no less than Mughniya, referring to Imad Mughniya, Hezbollah's military commander assassinated in Damascus in 2008. The comparison revealed how Shateri was viewed within the organization, not merely as an engineer, but as an architect of resistance. The public legend remained that of a builder bringing prosperity to war-torn communities. The internal reverence recognized a strategist whose blueprints shaped battlefields. A young Lebanese contractor who worked on several projects remembered a particular moment from July 2012. Shateri had insisted on personally inspecting a community center's foundation during a Mediterranean storm that had turned the construction site to mud. Through sheets of rain, he photographed each corner of the excavation, pausing repeatedly to wipe water from his camera lens with methodical care. The contractor held an umbrella that proved useless in the horizontal rain. He documented everything, the contractor recalled. Every beam, every joint, every connection. The camera was wrapped in plastic, but he kept having to clean the lens. He said water droplets distorted the documentation. Within 8 months, the man with the camera would be dead on the Damascus road, but his foundations would endure. The community center would be completed posthumously, its foundation exactly as he had documented it that rainy day. January 2013 opened with escalating shadow warfare across the Levant. On January 30th, Israeli jets struck a convoy near the Lebanese-Syrian border, destroying what intelligence sources described as SA-17 anti-aircraft missiles destined for Hezbollah. The attack, though never officially acknowledged by Israel, represented an escalation in the campaign between wars that had intensified since 2011. The Council on Foreign Relations documented this as part of Israel's new doctrine, preventing capability transfer rather than waiting to destroy capabilities after deployment. Against this backdrop of increasing violence, Shateri maintained his routine movements between Damascus and Beirut. According to later analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, he had traveled to Aleppo in late January to assess reconstruction needs in Syria's war-torn north, meeting with IRGC advisors supporting Assad's forces in the battle for Syria's largest city. The scale of destruction he witnessed there dwarfed anything from Lebanon 2006. Entire neighborhoods reduced to concrete dust that coated everything, requiring constant cleaning of equipment and weapons. A Syrian engineering officer who defected in 2014 told investigators about Shateri's Aleppo visit. He spent 3 days examining damaged infrastructure, taking hundreds of photographs. He was particularly interested in how structures had failed under bombardment, which foundations had held, which had collapsed. He said understanding destruction was necessary for better reconstruction. From Aleppo, Shateri returned toward Damascus to continue his journey to Lebanon. The pattern had become predictable to those who watch such movements, a vulnerability that experienced operators usually recognized and corrected. But Shateri had made this journey dozens of times. Familiarity bred a fatal comfort with routine. Iranian intelligence would later conduct an internal review of security procedures, though its findings remained classified. Iranian officials would later insist that armed terrorist groups and mercenaries loyal to the Zionist entity had tracked Shateri's movements. Reuters quoted Syrian rebels claiming their fighters had identified the convoy through local intelligence networks. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported increased communications intercepts in the days before the attack. Israeli officials maintained their traditional silence. Each narrative served its purpose, truth subordinated to strategic messaging. The competing versions would never reconcile. Arab News would quote a Syrian rebel commander, claiming credit for the operation, describing how his men had tracked Iranian vehicles for weeks. Iranian media would insist on a Zionist plot executed through proxies. Western intelligence assessments, leaked years later, suggested a level of precision that exceeded typical rebel capabilities. The operational truth remained locked in classified vaults that none would open. In Tehran, state television prepared what would become funeral footage. A cameraman cleaned his broadcast camera's lens with special care, preparing to document another martyrdom in the long war between Iran and its enemies. The regime had refined these ceremonies over decades. The flag-draped coffins, the crowds of mourners, the supreme leader's attendance signaling the fallen's importance. Production crews knew their roles: wide shots of crowds, close-ups of tears, careful framing of officials. Shateri would receive full honors, though few outside intelligence circles understood precisely why he merited such recognition. Intelligence collection intensified in the first week of February 2013. Satellites adjusted orbits to improve coverage of the Damascus-Beirut corridor. Signal intelligence units increased monitoring of IRGC communications. Human sources were tasked with reporting any unusual movements. France 24 would later report on the exceptional intelligence focus on Iranian movements during this period, though without explaining what had triggered such interest. Somewhere in that data flow, decisions crystallized. A convoy's route was confirmed. Assets were positioned. Weather forecasts were checked. Winter storms could provide cover or complicate operations. What one side called reconnaissance, another would soon call targeting. The machinery of covert warfare ground forward with bureaucratic precision. Authorization signed, communications tested, contingencies planned. By February 11th, all pieces were in position. The next day's journey would follow a road Shateri had traveled many times, through territory he believed he understood, toward a destination he would never reach. The Damascus-Beirut highway near Zabadani wore winter's gray on 12th of February 2013. Slush pooled in potholes while distant artillery echoed from contested hills, the sound of Syria's civil war providing constant background noise. Morning frost still clung to guardrails when the convoy departed Damascus, though by noon the weak sun had melted everything to mud. The road remained crucial for Assad's forces and Hezbollah operations, carrying supplies and personnel between Syria's capital and Lebanon's Shia heartlands despite the civil war that had fragmented the country. Traffic moves in fits and starts. Military checkpoints created bottlenecks where soldiers examined documents with fingers numbed by cold. Civilian vehicles mixed with military convoys, everyone impatient, everyone vulnerable. The highway had seen previous attacks, rebel ambushes, government airstrikes, criminal kidnappings. Violence had become routine enough that drivers barely flinched at distant explosions. Shateri's convoy moved through this landscape sometime that Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday morning. Accounts differ on the precise timing. The silver SUV carrying the general under his alias, Hessam Khoshnevis, had made this journey dozens of times. The vehicle's windows were tinted but not armored, a decision that suggested either confidence or fatalism. Inside, according to an aide who survived, Shateri reviewed reconstruction reports while occasionally photographing the war damage visible from the highway. His camera, the same Nikon he'd carried for years, sat on the seat beside him. Routine bred vulnerability. The attack, when it came, demonstrated precise intelligence and timing. The convoy had slowed near a section of road damaged by earlier fighting. Construction equipment partially blocked one lane. Traffic compressed. Options narrowed. What happened next remains disputed in official accounts, but clear in its outcome. Eyewitness accounts remained sparse and contradictory. Some reported gunmen emerging from roadside positions. Others described an explosion that targeted the center vehicle. A few claimed both. Coordinated attacks using multiple methods. A truck driver interviewed by Reuters days later said he saw armed men, but heard no explosion. A local resident told Arab News she heard an explosion, but saw no gunman. The documentary evidence, crater analysis, vehicle damage patterns, casualty reports suggested a coordinated strike rather than opportunistic violence. France 24 quoted a Western intelligence source suggesting the attack showed hallmarks of professional planning, precise timing, accurate targeting, rapid execution, no collateral damage to civilian vehicles. But even physical evidence could be interpreted multiple ways by analysts committed to different narratives. The immediate aftermath left little time for investigation. Syrian government forces arrived within minutes, cordoning the area and removing evidence before independent observers could document the scene. The convoy's surviving vehicles retreated toward Damascus. Shateri's body was recovered quickly, transported to Damascus airport, flown to Tehran before the road had been cleared of wreckage. A local mechanic interviewed years later recalled an incidental detail that captured the operation's opacity. His shop's security camera, positioned to cover the highway, had accumulated dust on its dome through the winter. He had meant to clean it that week, but hadn't yet climbed the ladder. The recording from 12 to 13 February showed only blurred shapes and movement. He cleaned the lens the following morning, after the convoy's wreckage had been removed. "I still have the footage," he said, "but it shows nothing useful, just shadows and light." Iranian state media reported the death with typical formulaic language. Hassan Shateri was martyred by armed terrorist groups on the road to Lebanon. The Syrian opposition claimed their forces had succeeded in targeting a senior Iranian commander participating in the criminal regime's war against the Syrian people. Neither version captured the calculated precision suggested by the attack's execution. The truth existed somewhere between narratives, in operational details that would remain classified for decades. In Tel Aviv, analysts updated their target databases, noting the date and location without commentary. Some victories were better left unclaimed. 15 February 2013 transformed Shateri from an operational asset to a propaganda symbol. Iranian outlets displayed photographs spanning his career. In IRGC uniform during the Iran-Iraq War, among Lebanese reconstruction sites, standing with religious leaders, inspecting foundations with his omnipresent camera. Western media reported on a senior Revolutionary Guards commander killed in Syria, their coverage focusing on Iran's deepening involvement in the Syrian civil war, rather than his specific role in Lebanon's reconstruction. Reuters ran a comprehensive profile citing unnamed intelligence sources who described Shateri as irreplaceable in terms of institutional knowledge. The Guardian quoted a Hezbollah official calling him the architect of resistance infrastructure. France 24 analyzed his death as a significant blow to Iranian regional strategy. Each outlet emphasized different aspects. The Western press focused on his military role, Iranian media on his humanitarian work, Arab outlets on his involvement in Syria's civil war. The headlines revealed through their emphasis: on the road from Damascus to Beirut, in charge of reconstruction projects in South Lebanon, Quds Force, commander responsible for Lebanon. The geographic specificity mattered. He died on the exact route his work had helped militarize, killed while traveling between the two countries his projects had helped connect strategically. Analysts at think tanks scrambled to explain why Shateri mattered beyond his rank. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies published an emergency assessment describing his role in creating Hezbollah's state within a state. The Middle East Institute noted that his death removed decades of institutional knowledge about Lebanon's physical and social infrastructure. The Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, maintaining careful neutrality, observed that his loss would complicate but not terminate Iranian reconstruction efforts. The comparison to Imad Mughnieh returned in Iranian cleric Alireza Panahian's televised sermon. Our Shateri was no less than Mughnieh. The parallel resonated across the region. Mugnieh had built Hezbollah's military doctrine. Shateri had built the physical infrastructure to implement it. Both had died in Damascus, 5 years apart, in operations that bore similar hallmarks. The symmetry was either coincidental or strategic, depending on perspective. Arab news published leaked intelligence suggesting both men had been killed at vulnerable moments. Mugnieh leaving a safe house, Shateri traveling a dangerous road. Both had maintained routines that eventually betrayed them. Both left vacuums that Iran struggled to fill. The comparison suggested that certain individuals possessed irreplaceable combinations of expertise, relationships, and vision. In Tehran's state television footage, mourners filed past Shateri's flag-draped coffin in Imam Hossein Square, while a cameraman paused to polish his lens with the edge of a black cloth before pressing record. The ritual of documentation continued even in grief. Every angle was captured, every dignitary's presence recorded, every chanted slogan preserved. The funeral became another form of construction, building narrative from loss, meaning from martyrdom. Supreme Leader Khamenei attended personally, a rare honor that signaled Shateri's importance. In his remarks, carefully parsed by intelligence analysts worldwide, Khamenei called Shateri a selfless architect of resistance who had built foundations that would outlast any individual. The metaphor was precise. Shateri's physical projects would endure, even if his expertise could not be replaced. Competing versions of events proliferated through media channels. Iranian outlets insisted on martyrdom at the hands of Zionist-backed terrorists. Syrian rebels claimed credit for eliminating an architect of sectarian oppression. Israeli sources remained silent, while Western analysts noted the strategic logic of removing someone who had spent 7 years hardening Hezbollah's position. Lebanese media, caught between narratives, focused on his reconstruction work while acknowledging his military role. The truth, as often happened in shadow wars, dissolved into multiple truths, each serving different masters. But one fact remained undisputed. The man who had spent 7 years documenting Lebanon's reconstruction with his camera would document nothing more. Late February 2013 brought calibrated responses from Tehran and Tel Aviv, each side signaling through actions and statements while avoiding direct confrontation. Mohammad Ali Jafari, IRGC commander, publicly vowed that Iran would soon exact revenge on Israel, explicitly linking Shateri's death to the broader regional confrontation. The Iranian parliament observed a minute of silence. State media broadcast documentaries about Shateri's reconstruction work, carefully editing out military implications while emphasizing humanitarian achievements. Internal IRGC documents remained classified, but open-source reporting from the Institute for the Study of War indicated sharp debates about protecting senior officers in Syria while maintaining operational tempo. The loss of institutional knowledge Shateri represented could not be easily replaced. His successor would need years to develop similar relationships and understanding of Lebanon's complex physical and social terrain. Israeli security circles, according to later think tank reconstructions and anonymous briefings, viewed Shateri's death as part of an expanding pattern. The campaign between wars had claimed numerous Iranian and Hezbollah operatives, degrading capabilities without triggering full-scale conflict. The Brookings Institution described this as mowing the grass, regular maintenance to prevent threats from maturing. Each successful operation bought time but guaranteed eventual regrowth. Former Israeli officials would later acknowledge the strategic dilemma in carefully worded memoirs. Retired Mossad Deputy Director Ram Ben Barak, writing in 2018, observed that tactical successes in covert operations often create strategic complications. Without confirming any specific operation, he noted that removing key figures could disrupt enemy planning, but also trigger adaptations that made future operations more difficult. The documentary, evidence from this period showed parallel adaptations. Iran began rotating senior officers more frequently, reducing predictability. Travel routes multiplied, with decoy convoys and last-minute changes becoming standard. Security details expanded to include electronic countermeasures and route reconnaissance. The Quds Force established new protocols requiring senior officers to vary routines and avoid patterns that intelligence services could exploit. On the Israeli side, target packages grew more complex as Iranian operations adapted. What had been straightforward interdiction became an elaborate chess match of move and countermove. Arms Control Association documented the escalating sophistication of both Iranian concealment efforts and Israeli detection capabilities. The shadow war was becoming institutionalized, with dedicated units, specialized technologies, and formal doctrines on both sides. The human cost appeared in the margins of official documents. A subtitled clip from Iranian television showed an official declaring, "We will take revenge on the Zionist regime for this crime and others." A separate interview with a former Israeli intelligence officer, recorded years later for an oral history project, offered the counterpoint. Every successful operation carries strategic risks we're still calculating. The officer, face obscured, voice altered, described the weight of decisions that could trigger regional war. Neither side acknowledged the families who received folded flags, the operators who carried psychological burdens, the civilians caught between competing versions of justice. A Lebanese merchant whose shop stood near one of Shateri's reconstruction projects observed, "The Iranians built our school. The Israelis might bomb it. We send our children anyway. What choice do we have?" A single artifact from March 2013 captured the operational tension. A staff officer in Tehran was photographed wiping fingerprints from a wall-mounted map's plastic overlay, clearing the view of Lebanon's coast. The gesture was practical, not symbolic, but it represented the constant recalibration required by Shateri's absence. His projects continued. New engineers arrived from Tehran. Construction resumed. Foundations were poured. But the institutional knowledge he carried had vanished on a winter road. Both sides would spend years understanding what that absence meant. For Iran, it meant reconstructing not just the organizational chart, but the entire network of relationships Shateri had cultivated. For Israel, it meant assessing whether his removal had achieved strategic effect or merely tactical disruption. For Lebanon, it meant continuing to live with infrastructure that served multiple purposes, never knowing which purpose would ultimately determine its fate. The operational timeline accelerated through 2013-2014 as Israel expanded strikes against Iranian-linked targets across the Syrian-Lebanese theater. Military chronologies documented systematic attacks on weapons convoys, storage facilities, and personnel moving advanced systems toward Hezbollah's arsenal. The Council on Foreign Relations recorded over a dozen attributed strikes in this period, with likely many more that remained unacknowledged. Intelligence History published a declassified assessment showing the target evolution. from individual weapons shipments to entire logistics networks, from senior commanders to technical specialists, from reactive strikes to preemptive shaping operations. Analysts at Western institutions identified this period as consolidation of Israel's prevention doctrine, continuous disruption rather than decisive confrontation. The goal was not victory, but management, keeping threats below thresholds that would require major military action. Maps overlaying Shateri's reconstruction footprint with subsequent strike locations revealed an unsettling correlation. The roads he had improved now carried the convoys that were targeted. The Damascus-Beirut highway saw 3 strikes in 6 months. The facilities he had hardened became priority targets. A warehouse complex near Baalbek that he had personally inspected was hit twice. The coastal infrastructure he had developed drew particular scrutiny from Israeli planners concerned about anti-ship missile deployments. The Institute for National Security Studies documented how Shateri's systematic approach had created what they called target-rich infrastructure, civilian projects whose military potential made them legitimate military objectives under certain interpretations of international law. This created moral and operational dilemmas for both sides. Iran had to decide whether to continue embedding military capabilities in civilian reconstruction. Israel had to weigh the propaganda cost of striking seemingly civilian targets. The logistical network persisted despite leadership losses. New IRGC officers arrived to manage reconstruction projects, though they lacked Shateri's relationships and intuitive understanding of Lebanese society. Engineers from Iran continued supervising foundation work that exceeded civilian requirements. The institutional momentum Shateri had created proved more durable than any individual. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies noted that project completion rates actually increased in the year after his death, as if Iran was determined to prove the irrelevance of any single person. This forced Israel into a cycle of repeated strikes, tactical successes that never achieved strategic resolution. The Modern War Institute analyzed this as the Shateri paradox. His death had removed expertise but not capability, disrupted planning but not purpose, delayed projects but not doctrine. Imagery analysts interviewed years later described the routine of recalibrating satellite and drone optics after each strike to assess damage and monitor repairs. We would hit a facility, watch them rebuild it, then hit it again. One recalled. The foundations Shateri poured seemed designed for exactly this cycle. Easy to repair, hard to eliminate permanently. The construction techniques he had implemented assumed eventual destruction and prioritized rapid reconstruction over permanent fortification. A Lebanese contractor who inherited several unfinished projects after Shateri's death found meticulous documentation in the Iranian offices. Every specification recorded, every deviation noted, every improvement photographed. Filing cabinets contained thousands of images from Shateri's camera, each labeled with dates, coordinates, and technical notes. The camera that had documented so much construction work had established institutional memory that survived its operator. It was like he expected someone else would need to continue the work, the contractor observed. The observation proved prescient. The work did continue, guided by blueprints whose strategic dimensions only became clear when they were targeted. New foundations were poured according to Shateri's specifications. Roads were widened following his plans. Coastal facilities were hardened using his designs. By late 2014, The shadow war had settled into patterns both sides understood, but neither could break. Iran continued building dual-use infrastructure. Israel continued degrading it. Lebanon continued living with the consequences. The cycle had become self-sustaining, with each side's actions justifying the other's responses. Shateri's death had been just one moment in this broader pattern, significant but not decisive, disruptive but not determinative. 2014 brought Shateri's absence into focus across South Lebanon's villages. The spring rains that year were particularly heavy, testing drainage systems he had designed. They held perfectly, channeling water away from foundations that might serve purposes beyond keeping basements dry. Locals, who had known him as the Iranian engineer who rebuilt their homes after 2006, spoke of him in past tense while living in structures he had designed. A memorial plaque appeared that April in a Bint Jbeil school he had personally overseen, though it was removed within days on orders from someone in Beirut or Tehran who preferred less visible commemorations. Municipal workers pulled out project photos where he appeared at the frame's edge, inspecting foundations or standing near the Mediterranean as waves broke against reinforced seawalls. One photograph particularly resonated. Shateri, examining a coastal construction site in 2011, his back to the camera, studying something beyond the frame while Mediterranean surf crashed behind him. His camera hung from his shoulder, lens cap off, ready to document whatever had caught his attention. A municipal employee brushed dust from the photo's plastic sleeve, an unconscious echo of the lens cleaning that appeared throughout his story. He stood there for an hour, the employee recalled, photographing the same section of seawall from different angles as the light changed. He said documentation was like prayer. It required patience and repetition. These projects outlasted commanders and conflicts, but they also drew fire. When tensions escalated, the same infrastructure became targeting coordinates. During the 2014 Gaza war, Israeli officials publicly warned that Lebanese infrastructure serving dual purposes would be considered legitimate targets in any future conflict. The message was clear. Shateri's reconstruction had painted targets on civilian buildings. The Iranian Committee for Reconstruction of Lebanon continued under new leadership. A Quds Force colonel, whose name remained unpublished, but whose approach differed markedly from Shateri's. Where Shateri had spent days on sites, the new director managed from offices. Where Shateri had photographed every detail personally, the new director relied on subordinates' reports. The thousands of projects Shateri had initiated continued, but without the meticulous attention that had characterized his tenure. The visible work proceeded. Homes rose, schools opened, roads connected previously isolated communities. The invisible work also continued. Foundations deeper than necessary, electrical systems more robust than required, communications infrastructure more redundant than civilian needs justified. The Middle East Institute documented over 500 projects completed posthumously using Shateri's plans, each one faithful to specifications whose full purpose remained known only to a few. A resident of a coastal town south of Tyre reflected on the paradox of Iranian reconstruction. They gave us beautiful buildings and modern roads, but we know that when the next war comes, these same buildings will be bombed because of what might be hidden beneath them. She lived in an apartment Shateri's projects had built, knowing it might make her a target, but having nowhere else to go. This was the dual inheritance of reconstruction. Concrete shelter that might become a crater. Her neighbor, an elderly man, who had survived 3 wars, was more philosophical. The Iranians build, the Israelis destroy, we rebuild again. Shateri understood this cycle. He designed it. These foundations are made to be destroyed and rebuilt. The question is not if, but when. The documentation Shateri had obsessively maintained proved invaluable to his successors. Every specification, every contractor, every deviation from plans had been recorded. His institutional legacy exceeded his physical projects. He had built not just infrastructure, but an entire system for building, one that would outlast any individual operator or operation. The camera that had captured thousands of construction images had created an archive that would guide projects for years after its lens was shattered. The mid-2010s found Israel's intelligence community processing years of campaign between wars operations. Former Mossad officials and national security advisors speaking in memoirs and public forums years after their service reflected on the moral and strategic complexities of sustained covert action. Their comments, while never confirming specific operations, illuminated the psychological architecture of those who planned and approved targeted killings. Every tactical success creates strategic uncertainty. Former Mossad director Tamir Pardo noted in a 2017 speech at Harvard. The observation applied directly to operations like Shateri's killing. Removing key figures disrupted enemy plans, but also triggered adaptations that made future operations more difficult. The Shadow War had its own physics. Action, generating reaction in endless cycles that no single operation could break. Intelligence History published interviews with retired officers who described the cumulative weight of these decisions. One analyst who had worked the Iran desk for a decade described reviewing Shateri's file. You see a person's entire life compressed into operational data. Birth certificate, education records, military service, travel patterns, financial transactions, communications metadata. You know more about them than their families do. Then one day, that file is closed, and you open the next one. The analysts who had tracked Shateri and others carried their own burden. Years spent studying individuals through surveillance feeds, reading intercepted communications, building pattern-of-life analyses that would determine targeting decisions. The work required a particular kind of moral distance, engaged enough to be effective, detached enough to function. A retired analyst, cleaning his glasses during an interview about the period, offered an inadvertent metaphor. You learn to live with the things you can't say. The gesture, wiping smudges from lenses, had become an unconscious ritual for those who spent careers trying to see clearly through moral fog. We joke that we need to clean our glasses so often because we're always trying to see things that aren't meant to be seen. But really, I think we're trying to wipe away things we've already seen. The infrastructure of decision-making left its own traces. Targeting committees met in windowless rooms where PowerPoint slides reduced human lives to operational variables. Legal advisors weighed proportionality using formulas that seemed precise but relied on assumptions that could never be verified. Technology officers maintained surveillance systems that grew more capable each year, able to track individuals across continents, but unable to peer into consciences. Arms Control Association published a study on the psychological impact of drone warfare on operators, but the same dynamics applied to those who planned covert operations. They returned home to families who would never know the full weight of their workdays. Children asked about their jobs and received vague answers about government work or analysis. spouses learned not to question unexplained absences or sudden mood changes. Each played a role in machinery that produced deaths documented only in classified archives. A former senior official, speaking on background to ProPublica, described the institutional momentum. Once you create these capabilities, they demand to be used. Once you start these operations, they become self-justifying. Each success requires another to maintain advantage. Each failure demands another to restore credibility. The long-term effects rippled through generations of intelligence officers. Those who had authorized operations against Iranian nuclear scientists and Quds Force commanders developed what one psychologist called operational calluses, the psychological armor necessary to function within ambiguous morality. The Times of Israel quoted a retired officer, "You tell yourself you're preventing larger violence. Maybe you are. But you're still causing violence. That contradiction lives inside you forever." The shadow war had changed not just regional dynamics, but the internal weather of those who waged it. Every success carried a cost that no operation report could quantify. The 2020s extended the logic that had made Shateri a target into new domains and generations. Iran's IRGC, including its naval and Quds Force elements, continued projecting power toward the Mediterranean despite leadership losses. The organization had adapted to assume attrition, building redundancy into every level of command. Israel expanded covert and overt operations against Iranian personnel and infrastructure across the region. The shadow war had become institutionalized, its patterns as predictable as they were unresolvable. Le Monde documented the geographic expansion of these operations. Iranian nuclear scientists eliminated in Tehran, drone program leaders killed in mysterious explosions, weapons engineers found dead from Syria to Iraq. Each operation followed templates established in the previous decade: precise intelligence, plausible deniability, limited collateral damage. The tactics had become doctrine, passed between generations of operators like institutional memory. Later assassinations of IRGC figures revealed evolutionary adaptations on both sides. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, Iran's nuclear program architect, was killed in November 2020 using an automated weapon that suggested Israeli operations had moved beyond human triggers. Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani died in an American drone strike that showed how normalized targeted killing had become. Each operation was justified as preventing future capability, each death generating new cycles of retaliation planning that would require further prevention. The Financial Times analysis of this period described a permanent shadow war that had replaced traditional concepts of peace and conflict. Neither side could achieve decisive victory, but neither could accept the status quo. The result was continuous low-intensity warfare that occasionally spiked but never resolved. Shateri's killing in 2013 had been an early moment in what became an endless campaign. Iranian and Hezbollah martyrdom narratives transformed each loss into motivation for continuation rather than reconsideration. Shateri's image appeared in propaganda videos alongside other martyrs of resistance. His reconstruction projects cited as evidence of Iran's commitment to Lebanon. Every killing fed a narrative that demanded replacement, not retreat. The infrastructure he had built, physical and ideological, proved more durable than any individual life. Arab news documented how Iran's Mediterranean strategy survived leadership losses by becoming institutional rather than personal. New commanders arrived with the same mission Shateri had pursued: embed military capability within civilian infrastructure, create redundant networks that could survive degradation, establish permanent presence that time would legitimize. The methods were his, even if the men were different. In Beirut in 2024, a young Lebanese videographer born during the 2006 war cleaned a second-hand camera lens before documenting protests about economic collapse and reconstruction delays. The streets he filmed told multiple histories. Some had been paved under Shateri's supervision. Others showed damage from recent Israeli airstrikes. Still others waited for repairs that might never come. His generation had inherited infrastructure shaped by conflicts they didn't start and couldn't end. My parents remember when these streets were rubble. He told a reporter, "I only know them as streets, but I also know they might become rubble again." We live between construction and destruction, always waiting for the next cycle. The infrastructure of conflict had become generational inheritance. Roads that connected communities and made them targets. Buildings that sheltered families and concealed capabilities. Foundations that served present needs while preparing for future wars. Every generation learned to see dual purposes in single structures, to understand that civilian and military were categories that dissolved under sufficient pressure. The lens motif persisted across time and participants. Each side constantly cleaned their optics, literal and metaphorical, trying to see clearly through the dust of ongoing operations. But clarity remained elusive. The same intelligence that prevented attacks also perpetuated conflicts. The same reconstruction that helped civilians also enabled militants. Every cleaned lens revealed new ambiguities rather than resolution.